So the big story right now is the drone attack on Moscow. And I'm going to try to unpack everything that surrounds this. Who did it, why they did it, and I'm still scratching my head because I can't figure out some piece of this. And you'll understand what I'm saying by the time that I'm done. So the big news clearly is this. I mean, it's in CNN, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, NBC News. It's all everything. The big headline is the drone attack. Now, we're going to watch a clip from CNN and try to see what they had to say about this. This was yesterday's coverage so that you see it, and that's going to set the table for everything that goes forward from here.
Ukraine, for the first time in the 400 plus days since the invasion began, civilian areas of Moscow may have been targeted. This plume of smoke is the apparent aftermath of Russia shooting down a drone, one of 8 that their Ministry of Defense says was stopped over the capital.
So this is a big event. But when you read Russian media, you don't see it as a big event. That's what I'm scratching my head about. I'm trying to figure out, like, why is that the case? Let's keep going.
Посмотри, брат. Ты видишь? Вот ровно. So far, no deaths have been reported, though drone debris has damaged several buildings there. Russia is blaming Ukraine, and its Interior Ministry issued arrest warrants for 2 senior Ukrainian commanders. But an advisor for Ukraine's president issued this denial, saying, quote, "We enjoy watching and predicting an increase in attacks, but of course, we have nothing to do directly with it." In the meantime, Ukraine's capital has been bombarded for days, the 17th aerial assault by Russia this month alone.
And so now I asked you in a poll, Moscow drone attacks were, and I gave you these options. And essentially, you had a almost even split between Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, a false flag operation, and either Ukrainian partisans, which people thought was very small, or Russian partisans. And so I guess if you collapse those two last categories together, you'd have that partisans would be the overwhelming favorite, but not by a whole lot. I mean, it's almost a third. So that's what you all think. Now let's keep going.
On Moscow, absolutely unprecedented since the Russians started their full-on invasion of Ukraine. And you are absolutely right. Vladimir Putin, seemingly quite angry, pointed the finger of blame squarely at Kiev. Here's what he said.
Kyiv chose the path of intimidation of Russian citizens and attacks on residential buildings. It is a clear sign of terrorist activity. The Moscow air defense system worked satisfactorily. However, there is still work to be done to make it better.
Now that little clip was only one of 2 or 3 videos that I saw on RT. You would think RT would be shouting this from the rooftops, but they weren't. And that's what I'm scratching my head about. Something doesn't add up. Now the ISW had an interesting assessment, and it was interesting because in the last time this happened with the strike on the Kremlin, they called it a false flag. The head of the Russian partisan force said that they took credit for it a little while later, but the ISW was silent here about whether it was a false flag or not. They said this: Russia claimed that Ukraine conducted a series of drone strikes against Moscow on May 30th, as Russia again targeted Ukraine with Iranian-made Shahed drones. The Russian Ministry of Defense accused Ukraine of attacking Moscow with 8 drones on the morning of May 30th, claimed that Russian forces shot down 5 of the drones and suppressed 3 drones with electronic warfare. Some targeted the prestigious neighborhood in Moscow. Ukrainian presidential aide denied that Ukraine was involved, but then it said this: Russian President Vladimir Putin attempted to downplay the drone attack on Moscow to avoid exposing the limited options that he has to retaliate against Ukraine. That's really interesting. Now, one of the things that makes me wonder about this was just how limited the response was from the Russian propaganda side. It sounds terrible, but my first thought when I saw this was, how much Russian propaganda am I going to have to wade through in order to make sense of this? And it was unusually low. You'd see an article like this: Putin on the Moscow drone attack. We will see what to do about it. Putin said that Kyiv attempts to intimidate Russian citizens by attacking residential buildings. This, of course, is a clear sign of terrorist activity. Putin also said that Moscow's air defense system showed satisfactory performance. That's it? I mean, that was nothing. Now, I looked at RT yesterday and again this morning, and there was little about the drone strike except the boilerplate stuff. Things like Britain is de facto at war with Russia or the US is encouraging it. Then they had a little bit about it, like this article here, UK-backed Ukrainian terror attack in Moscow, or the Kremlin outlines why Ukraine launched an attack on Moscow, or Putin confirming it. But it was really, there wasn't a lot beyond that. And it's really interesting. Then I looked at RT's videos, and there was also not a lot of their videos. It's just, I mean, it seems like this is a pretty big event and you'd want to talk more about it. When I got up this morning, I saw this crosstalk, unacceptable escalation. I thought, gotta wade through this 25 minutes. But I started, and he started talking about how jets were unacceptable escalation. I thought, Moscow was just hit by drones. Here's Vlad. I'm going to let him set the table a little bit to talk about the drone attacking context, and then we'll see what Putin had to say. So here's Vlad, just the first minute or so.
Unprecedented drone attack on Moscow. What we need to put on the table first, though, is the wider context, which is that Russia has been waging a war against Ukraine for several years.
Mm-hmm.
And in February 2022, that became a brutal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, backed by genocidal rhetoric and containing regular terroristic practices where civilian infrastructure and civilians are targeted. So that's the context in which we're going to talk about what's happening in Moscow.
Okay, so that's the context in which we should understand it. Now, this is how Putin responded. He responded not by getting irate, but by just discussing all the normal talking points that he wants to continue to propagate. So, President of Russia's website answered a question about the drone attack on Moscow and Moscow's region. The interviewer asked, "Drones attacked Moscow and the Moscow region this morning. Can you comment on what happened? As you know, it all began long ago. I will just need to repeat the story." And he doesn't talk so much about drone attacks, but he talks about his talking points. After the collapse of the USSR, some rivalry between Russia and Ukraine was inevitable, obviously, but it seems that those who were dealing with this believed that it would be done in a civilized way, and moreover, with regard to our historical, cultural, linguistic affinity. But it all went the other way, unfortunately, which should have been expected. Basically, the territory that is called Ukraine, notice he's not saying Ukraine, the territory that is called Ukraine was virtually controlled from the very beginning by people who, being led by the West, took the path of not just confronting Russia, but creating an anti-Russia on that territory. Okay, so he's just trying to confirm his talking points. From the very beginning, this first step, it declared itself a neutral state. This is written in the Declaration of Independence. Instead, they gradually turned to a different path, joining NATO, an organization that is hostile to Russia. Well, you could have been invited to NATO if you were going to play nice. In 2008, without any external signs, without any military political tension, they announced that they were joining NATO. They wanted to join NATO, and the Western countries, the alliance members, announced in Bucharest, I think, at the summit that the NATO's doors were open to Ukraine. In 2014, as you know, they carried out a coup d'etat, and simply, okay, it wasn't a coup d'etat. I keep hearing this from all Russian propaganda sources, and this is the fount of that. Okay, not a coup d'etat. Simply began to destroy everyone who, in one way or another, wanted to build normal relations with Russia. They also unleashed a war and military operations in the Donbass. They did it. Who invaded Donbass and unleashed a war? Okay, Russian armed forces, which had to respond. Here he's talking about in 2022. Russia was forced to respond to the war the Ukrainian regime unleashed in Donbass. What? We all had to respond by launching the special military operation. We are striking at the territory of Ukraine. The territory of Ukraine, not Ukraine. Hear that? But with long-range precision weapons at military infrastructure facilities only. Really? Either ammunition or fuel and lubricants warehouses used for combat operations. Well, tell that to the people of Ukraine, because they're not, I guess getting the memo. Russia launches, this is 2 days ago, Russia launches 16th airstrike on Kyiv this month. They're up to 17 by the time they got to this. Explosions rang out across Kyiv on Monday as Russia launches 16th air attack on the Ukrainian capital this month. Hours after unleashing dozens of missiles and drones overnight, panicked residents, some of who initially ignored the air raid sirens as they ate breakfast in cafes, rushed for cover when the skies filled with smoke trails and blast clouds. Okay, so are they just targeting military facilities? No, they're not. We've talked about the possibility of striking at decision-making centers. In response, the Kyiv regime has chosen a different path, attempts to intimidate Russian citizens with strikes at residential buildings. This is an obvious terrorist approach. Okay, so this is the only place in this whole thing that he talks about drones. Right? Everything else was just his basic talking points all the way through when he's asked about it. So it's a strange, somewhat muted response. And here, let's go look at this, because I think Georgie's going to give us a little sense of where they were striking and how they were striking. So let's listen to him.
How they did it and what was the reaction. Because roughly we can separate this part of Putin's area around Moscow into three major groups. One is Putin and his kind of direct associates. It's like people who are executed on his orders. Second is major kind of oligarchs, the power players. You know, Russia is a kleptocracy. There is a lot of these people that have some influence in Russia that could have influenced Putin in one way or another, but because they are bound by him by the dirty money that they earned over the many years, then this is the people around them. And then the third one is a more general Russian population. Now we can break it down further, but for this context, we are interested into these three groups. These drones that were set out, they were sent out to attack a very specific area around the Moscow city. It's just outside of the Moscow city. It is an area that is so-called Rublyovka. Rublyovka is an area where the group number 2 that I described, and also some people from group number 1, the ultra-rich. But the important part here is because we're in a capitalist society, right? For us, if a person has money, that's not a big deal. In this case, because Russia is a kleptocratic state, this is like this area here, it's not like that you can just buy land there. It's not a free access area. It's like the den of evil. It's like the complete amalgamation of all of the corruption, of all things that Russia was having and got stolen from. So all of the stolen money from Russia, and all of the people that don't appear on camera, that were just stealing behind the curtains, that were smarter than Putin himself, they lived in that area and can actually have an influence on Putin, especially when we're talking in the context of war. So that's the only people that kind of matter in the Putin's Russia, because it's a court.
So if I'm hearing him correctly, the drone strike hit the Beverly Hills, the rich area of the capital city where the oligarchs live, and it was an attack on them.
Drones were flying around. These people started panicking. And Russian air defense, and I'm going to get back to it, was shooting down, and they were panicking because they heard explosions above their heads. And the third part of the population, the Russian common folk, instead of like being, oh my God, what would be like happening in the West, and that's kind of one of the biggest representatives why the Western analysts are so wrong so often. They were like, not that's like, oh my God, we're being attacked. No, when they saw that the people in that area are being bombed, the Russian population went online on all of the forums and all of the discussions, and they started laughing. They're saying, yes, please, why there was so few drones flying that area? Please burn that place to the ground. It was a sense of a weird unity of a Russian population that went around a lot of these public network spaces where people discuss their opinions, that it is so good that these bastards are finally getting what they deserve, and they should deserve even more. And a lot of people, beyond them doing that, they didn't blame this whole situation on Ukraine. Ukraine was almost non-existent beyond the propaganda circles that tried to essentially whitewash this whole situation and blame everything on Ukraine. Beyond those propagandist channels and like super Nazis, majority of the normal population in Russia were just expressing, yes, it's all Putin's fault. Now,
Okay, so that's a really interesting perspective. And then we look at what was actually going on the Russian propaganda channels. So this little clip from the Russian media monitor I want to show you because it was really subdued, and I found that to be incredibly strange. So let's look at this together. I will read the text. The drone strikes have absolutely no effect on the redistribution of forces in Donbass. They won't affect anything at all. So if the military effect is non-existent, what is the point? The goal is purely political, to create social and political tensions. To say that the Russian government can't even defend Moscow, let me be judged by anyone who wants to do it. I believe that these strikes are very positive for us. Very positive. Why? For one simple reason. It mobilizes society. So our society starts to understand the conditions we find ourselves in. Their effect is non-existent. But the social and political effect is very serious, leading to unity and understanding of who the enemy is, leading to the understanding that right now we have a very serious enemy. This enemy could blow up your car, he could blow up your entryway. You have to be careful and thoroughly look around where you live, what you're dealing with, what to do. This is very important. It is good for the mobilization of society. Okay, let's move on now. What? This was it was just bizarre. Like like that was the biggest amount of talking. It was amazing. Now let's go and look at two other views of this because I'm trying to give you multiple perspectives so that you can have some insight of what's going on. Here's Jake Bro, and Jake Bro is unabashedly in the false flag camp. So here we go.
So I have to mention it, but this morning in Moscow there was a drone attack. The Russians are pretty quick to blame Ukraine. And I have to mention it, there's always the possibility that, yes, Ukraine did launch their own drones to attack residential areas in Moscow. But I don't really believe that Ukraine did this. I think this is another Russian false flag attack, comparable to that bizarre drone attack on the Kremlin last month, in which the Russians claimed it was an assassination attempt on Putin. We keep hearing these reports that Moscow believes they need more motivation for their people to volunteer for the military, to support Putin, to support this war of aggression. So here's why I think it's a false flag operation. When Russia launches drones and missiles against Kyiv, they can come from the north in Belarus, they can come from the south in Crimea or the occupied territories, and they can come from the east in Russia. It's pretty daunting for Kyiv to protect itself from three directions. But for Moscow, you know where the drones are coming from. Ukraine is launching from the Russian-Ukrainian border. So for Ukrainian drones to successfully make it 500 kilometers to hit residential buildings in Moscow, I mean, Russia's air defense systems have to be completely terrible if Ukraine can successfully do this. Additionally, this was launched during the daytime. If Ukraine wanted to successfully hit valid military targets, they would launch the drones in the middle of the night so people couldn't see them.
Now, so he's making some valid assumptions, and I don't know which is right or which is wrong, but yeah, if Ukraine wanted to do this, either the Russian systems are so bad, or they learned something in the past, or but why would they do it during the day? So that leads us toward that false flag kind of narrative, or at least it wasn't Ukraine proper, but partisans that are closer by.
The fact that people took pictures and videos of these drones flying through Moscow, the goal was visibility, to be seen, an act of terrorism. So either Ukraine is engaging in their own form of terrorism, or it's a false flag operation by the FSB to motivate Russians to support this war.
Now, the only trick with Jake, and everything that he said was valid, it makes sense. The only trick there is that Anders Puck Nielsen talked about how false flag operations work, and that usually you don't want to look bad and you want to get lots of political mileage out of it. Now, they kind of look bad and they're getting political mileage, but I can't discount Jake's points. I mean, he's making valid points. Let's go on and look at Vlad Vexler and see what he has to say about this as well, and we'll compare notes.
There is a popular false flag narrative doing the rounds, and here's my comment on it. If you think that the drone attack on Moscow is very likely a false flag, right, then you've become a victim of the gamification of war. If you're sitting there and you say, well, I don't know who did it, that's increasingly suspicious, right? Because Ukraine said they were going to retaliate for Russia's terroristic actions on their territory just in the last few days. Then we see a bunch of drones over Moscow, and then people are saying, ooh, who could this be? I mean, So 50-50 is already suspicious, but I'm going to let you off the hook. And I'm certainly going to let you off the hook if you think there's a 20% chance that there's a false flag operation. But if you're saying there's a 99 or there is an 80% chance this is a false flag, then you are making something that is no longer a mistake, right? The fault is not anymore in the arguments for and against causality. It's in the deeper place. You've been swept up by something, right? There's something in you that's being pulled and baited, right? And you are becoming, as it were, a victim of a kind of pull or pressure. Now, much the same could have been said about the drone attack on the Kremlin. That's to say, it's completely reasonable to say it could be a false flag, right? But at the time that drone attack on the Kremlin happened, the people who said it was very probably a false flag attack indicated a lack of understanding of domestic Russian politics. Right? But with this situation, it's even more extreme. That's to say, we don't need to rule anything out, right? But as far as early presuppositions go, right, there are certain places where it is so spectacularly plausible to start that it's not right any longer to talk about for and against particular explanations. It's right to pathologize those, and it's my job to not to tell you what to think, because I don't mind if you think it's a false flag operation still, but my job is to tilt you, right? Next, how will the Kremlin respond? Well, we saw...
And so that's my question. How did the Kremlin respond? And it didn't seem to respond in the full-throated, we're going to crush you for this kind of way that I've expected to see. And I expected to see releasing of the hounds, and I just haven't seen that. And that's the thing that's very interesting to me.
Or a completely pathetic statement from Putin, who's been engaging in grotesque terrorism on Ukrainian territory for a long time, that makes this obviously attack on Moscow pale in comparison. But Putin said that these are terroristic tactics from Ukraine, and he has said that roughly the attack has been well handled. And so that implies that they're not going to do much about it, they can't do much about it, and that they may not even bother, having a dance and a jingle with their nuclear bomb about it, although probably somebody will on Russian propaganda TV. And this is an attempt to play down what's happened. So let's say more about this.
That's exactly right. They've attempted to play down what's happened, and that's what's fascinating. They said more. They were more livid about Lindsey Graham's words than they were about an actual attack in Moscow. So where does that leave us? Don't know. But we've given you a menu of options to kind of sort out and see what your opinions are. And I'm curious to see what you think or what you can add to the conversation between Georgie's perspective and between Vlad's and Jake's and whatever limited perspective I've been able to offer here. So that's all that I have. And I hope that this helps you think and process what's going on. Leave me your comments below. Thank you for caring enough to listen to me to this point, and for the likes and the coffees and the shares and the subscribes. But more than anything else, thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. I'll be back tomorrow, and I hope you will be too.